Noni. The dreaded horsemen that brought such terror in the hearts of Berlin, Vienna and other places that they were comparable to the primordial forces of nature. The words of Zapsplat define the image of the Finnish cavalry forces of the 1600s to this day. The Hakkapeliitta riders are no doubt the most famous unit of Finnish military history before the Second World War. So let's take a look at these harbingers of death from the battlefields of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, which was a colossal and long conflict in Europe in the 1600s. If you remember from the previous episode, Sweden took part in it from 1630 to 1635, changing the course of the war in favor of the Protestants. Much of the Swedish army consisted of troops drafted from Finland, especially in the cavalry, where Finns sometimes formed the majority. These cavalry forces were often key in deciding the outcome of battles, so it is no wonder that the Hakkapeliitta forces remain legendary to this day. In this video we will look at the history, tactics, equipment and reputation of the famous Finnish mounted harbingers of death. But let's start from the very basics. How did one become a Hakkapeliitta, or sometimes Hakkapel in English? Since the Middle Ages, supplying a mounted soldier to the Swedish army would bring attractive tax reliefs to the house. So for those that could afford it, it was potentially a lucrative option and certainly more appealing than being forcibly drafted into the infantry. The riders had to provide their own horse and weapons. With the risk of a precious horse dying in battle, I imagine they would not choose the best workhorse of the house when possible. The rider and horse had to be replaced by the house if they happened to die on campaign. So despite the tax benefits, we can't say that it was a guaranteed get-rich scheme either. The golden age of the Hakkapeliittas was the 30 Years' War, before the allotment system called ruotujako. The early 1600 system can, however, be seen as its predecessor, with a set of houses providing one armed soldier. The equipment of the Hakkapeliittas was key to how they fought. But first, do you have a moment to hear not about today's sponsor, but an overview of 1600s weapons of war? I will give one anyway. The 17th century marks an interesting period in military history and a transition from the heavily armored medieval knight to the age of the musket-wielding line infantry. The predominant infantry weapon was the matchlock musket, much like a handheld cannon with a vastly improved user experience. Besides the musket, the foot soldier formations wielded pikes, basically very long spears originally designed to keep cavalry at bay. The cavalry, whether or not kept at bay, were often clad in heavy armor, much like modernized medieval knights, and wielding swords and pistols. As I said before, the Hakkapeliittas had to provide their own weapons, which were, as you might guess, swords and wheel-lock pistols. Their armor, in cases we can even call it such, was typically lighter than that of their enemies. It sometimes included a steel breastplate and helmet typical of the era. In place of the breastplate, or under it, could also be a leather buff coat. While this would not stop bullets, it offered decent protection against sword cuts. Moreover, it is a real example of leather armor, which is all too common and stupid in fantasy. The most important piece of equipment, if we call it such, was of course their horse. Johan Tserklas, a field marshal who commanded the Catholic League's forces in the 30 Years' War, wrote, for the horsemen's iron tendons and unyielding bravery until death perfectly made up for that which they lacked in appearance, and their tiny horses were aided by the toughness of the Finnish race, which during the hours-long battle greatly affected the achieving of victory. The Hakkapeliittas horses were the predecessors of today's Finn horses. Unlike the large mounts of the imperial armies bred for war, the Finnish horses were tiny, unimpressive workhorses, and by tiny I really mean it. They were no larger than small ponies, and the sight of them often amused foreign fighters. This 1909 photo of a Karelian horse gives an idea. But as Zapsplat put it, they made up for their unimpressive looks by their toughness and calmness. They were, after all, workhorses and no strangers to hardship. This, essentially their sisu, if you want to call it that, prevented them from wearing out in long battles like the large and handsome imperial horses. It was no doubt also helpful on long marches. How did the famous Finnish cavalry fight then that they were so effective? To understand this, would you have a moment to hear not about today's sponsor, but the fashion in which wars were fought in the early 1600s. I will try to explain it briefly anyway. Armies fought in large formations of cavalry, infantry and artillery. As mentioned earlier, the cavalry was somewhat of a descendant of medieval knights, at least for the Catholic armies of the 30 Years' War, relying on the force of the heavily armored horsemen. This time they were, however, typically wielding pistols which they would fire from close range and then return to reload. The artillery was also on the heavy side, with cannons that were not yet incredibly wieldy. The infantry of the Hakkapeliitta's enemies fought in the Spanish square formation of pikemen and musketeers, a formation which had been proven highly effective in earlier conflicts. Sweden's king Gustav Adolf was a smart guy when it came to war. Finland, of course, was part of Sweden at that time, and the Finns fought in the Swedish army, in case that was not clear by this point. The Swedish army underwent reforms under Adolf's rule, making it maybe the most modern army in Europe at that point. Old, heavy doomsday cannons were replaced by lighter, mobile ones. Lightness and mobility were the themes of the cavalry as well, and the cooperation of all the army branches was honed to be smooth and effective. The Swedish army started the battles with effective artillery and musket fire, which weakened the Catholic formations. They were then ripe for the Hakkapeliittas to charge into, and for that they are famous. As I said earlier, the typical cavalry of the time fought not by charging, but by repeatedly firing and retreating to reload. The Swedes, smart as they were, had learned a different trick from their wars in Poland. They would charge in a tight formation knee to knee and fire their pistols from close range. After firing their guns though, they wouldn't turn back to reload. Instead, they would draw their swords and charge into the now wavering enemy ranks, with the Finns allegedly shouting their war cry "Hakka päälle pohjan poika," which also gives the unit their name. This was highly effective in breaking the enemy formations and often key to deciding the outcome of battles. The Germans were shocked how these ragged and ill-equipped foreigners on ridiculous horses could beat their professional, well-armed forces. The war cry translates roughly to "Get them, son of the north." The Finns, being Finns, were generally very quiet apart from the battle cry, and that terrified their enemies. After all, they were there to fight, not to shout some long and elaborate chants. Speaking of terrific sounds, the music in these videos is by Karne, and I cannot recommend enough that you go and check his music out. Links are in the description. The Hakkapeliittas being quiet might actually be more connected to their success in battle, for the language of the army was Swedish, which the Finns couldn't speak, nor any other language of the countries in which they were fighting. They might sometimes not even have been aware of where it was on the map that they were sent to fight. This likely helped them bond together as a unit, and they were well aware that fighting as fiercely and with as much sisu as possible was their best chance of making it out alive. Being these aliens without language skills, changing sides to join the winning army was not an option like it was for the European mercenaries in the war. The war was cruel and cavalry brutal, as we say, a saying allegedly dating back to the 30 Years' War, although I couldn't find a reliable source for that. And they were indeed an exotic sight on the European battlefields of the time. A diary of an anonymous French soldier writes that the Finns are mostly short, yet brave and no strangers to hardship. They live and get by with little nutrition and care little for luxuries. They find the German climate mild even in the winter compared to their own cold climate. They are true eaters of iron, for no weapon frightens them, nor have they ever been wounded from behind. If someone from their unit were to turn their back on the enemy, they would not count him as one of theirs. Amusing it is to watch them set out for battle, for they have whetstones hanging on their sides, and as soon as the orders to move are given and the beating of the drums starts, they start honing their blades. From afar it might look like a bunch of butchers or reapers ready for business, but it is no joke dealing with the Finns when it comes to battle. As we can see from period sources already, the Finnish horsemen were known by their own reputation despite being part of the Swedish cavalry. It is a little hard to know how famous or infamous they were at the time and whether their reputation has been exaggerated by nationalist depictions of history. As the Swedish army plundered through the German countryside, leaving corpses and ruins behind, I doubt the peasants were afraid of the Finns in particular, although, apparently, some prayers survive to this day that beg the Lord to protect the people from the terrible Finns. But then again, 17th century Catholics were deeply superstitious and had a prayer for pretty much everything, or so I imagine anyway. Another thing I wonder is the war cry. Now when we talk about the Hakkapeliittas, we tend to imagine them screaming Hakka päälle as explained earlier. But would that really have been something they all always shouted when charging? As far as I know, there are not a lot of primary sources that would confirm that, and the association only starts to become common after the golden age of the Hakkapeliittas. I'm not saying that they didn't shout it, of course, just wondering where history maybe meets legend and folklore. It is also worth noting that the term Hakkapeliitta initially referred to the Finnish horsemen, but later on could mean other Finns serving in the Swedish army too, as far as we know. Anyway, that was the story of the famous Finnish cavalry. If this brought any thoughts or prayers to your mind, let us know in the comments. Also, do consider becoming a member of the channel if these videos resonate with you. You can also give me your money by buying a t-shirt, for example, so I can become a rich and obnoxious influencer. So far I'm neither rich nor that influential. Also, some of you might be interested to know that I'm planning to offer high-quality prints of this and other illustrations you've seen on the channel when I switch accountants next month, and it will be easier to ship them internationally. The prints, that is. I do not ship accountants. And as always, if Finnish mythology and history are close to your heart, see a cardiologist and then check out my other videos.